From the darkest reaches of space to the deepest corners of your mind. Welcome to From the Void.
Welcome to From the Void. Settle in next to me by the fire. Tonight's tale comes from Brazil, 1966. Two men found dead on a lonely hillside, their bodies dressed in matching suits, lead masks covering their eyes, no signs of a struggle, no clear cause of death. Just a note with cryptic instructions, and a mystery that's haunted investigators and storytellers ever since. Were they victims of a strange scientific experiment gone wrong, initiates in some kind of secret ritual, or explorers trying to shield themselves from something not of this world? No one knows for certain, but here, by the fire, we'll retrace their final steps and peer into one of the strangest unsolved cases in modern history. This is the story of the lead masks of Vintém Hill, and you've just stepped into the void. Tonight's story takes us to the steep hillsides above Niterói, Brazil, in the late summer of 1966. It's a case that has haunted investigators, journalists, and UFO enthusiasts for nearly 60 years. But let's start with a word of caution. This is a difficult case. The autopsy was delayed long enough that decomposition erased vital forensic evidence. Toxicology tests were essentially impossible. And many of the best primary sources, contemporaneous police files, detailed forensic reports, either never survived or have not been made public. What we have are newspaper accounts, family testimonies, and a few named witness statements. Enough to trace the mystery, but never enough to close it. On the afternoon of August 20th, 1966, locals made a grim discovery on Morro do Vintem. Some later reports say it was a boy flying a kite who came across the bodies, though that detail has never been firmly verified. What is certain is this. Two men lay side by side in the grass, dressed in suits and raincoats, with homemade lead plates covering their eyes. Picture the hillside of Morro do Vintem on an August afternoon. The grass is high, the air is heavy, and below the hill you can hear the hum of Niterói spilling into Guanabara Bay. On the slope, two bodies are lying side by side. Each man is dressed in a formal suit, topped with a waterproof raincoat. Over their eyes are crude, homemade plates of lead. Not goggles, but solid shields. Near them, an empty water bottle, two small towels, and a notebook containing a single cryptic set of instructions. There are no obvious injuries, no signs of a struggle, no blood, just two men prepared for something, and whatever it was, it killed them both. The two men weren't strangers or drifters. They were technicians. Manoel Pereira de Cruz, 32, and Miguel José Viana, 34, lived and worked in a city about 170 miles northeast of Rio de Janeiro. Both earned their living repairing televisions, radios, and electronic equipment. In the mid-1960s, that was highly skilled work. Brazil was electrifying at speed, and men like Cruz and Viana kept households connected to the new media age. But for them, it wasn't just a job. Friends and family later told reporters that the two men were fascinated by the invisible world behind the circuits. They were drawn into a movement popular in Brazil at the time called scientific spiritualism. And this wasn't seance tables and crystal balls. Scientific spiritualists believed that spirits, or even extraterrestrial intelligences, might be detected, contacted, or communicated with using the tools of science: radios, transmitters, electrical circuits, These weren't just machines. They were gateways. The idea was that if spirits were real, they should leave traces that technology could capture. In Brazil of the 1960s, groups met at clubs, published manuals, and held experiments trying to tune into other dimensions. Some set up radios or recorders hoping to hear voices. Others tried to measure strange electromagnetic fields. For Cruz and Viana, men who had already spent their days working with wires and tubes, this was a natural extension of their skills. Investigators later found spiritualist books and notes at their homes, suggesting that they weren't just dabbling, but were deeply committed. On August 17, 1966, the men told their families that they were traveling to Niterói to buy electronic materials, maybe even a car. They boarded a bus carrying cash. Around 2:30 that afternoon, they arrived in town. There they bought waterproof raincoats, picked up a bottle of water, and stopped briefly at a bar. The barmaid would later recall Miguel looking nervous, checking his watch again and again. That was the last time either man was seen alive. And here's where the record goes quiet. After leaving that bar, there are no further witness testimonies that place Cruz and Viana on their way up Morro do Vintem. No shopkeepers, no passers-by, no bus driver or fellow passengers ever came forward to describe how they reached the hillside that we're aware of. From that point on, the men simply vanish into silence until their bodies are discovered 3 days later. 3 days after Cruz and Viana boarded that bus to Niterói, their families still had not heard from them. On the afternoon of August 20th, 1966, locals climbing Morro do Vintem stumbled onto a chilling sight. Some later accounts claim it was a boy flying a kite who first saw them, though that detail remains unconfirmed. What is certain is that the bodies of two men were lying side by side on the hillside grass. They were dressed in formal suits, with raincoats pulled over them. Over their eyes, each man wore a homemade plate of lead. Not goggles with glass, but solid shields that blocked vision entirely. Close at hand, investigators cataloged a short list of personal effects. An empty water bottle purchased that same afternoon, 2 small towels slightly damp, a notebook containing a single page of instructions. The strangest thing? There were no obvious injuries. No bruises, no gunshot wounds, no sign of a struggle. The men appeared to have simply lain down together on the hillside, waiting for something that never came. Among the few belongings found near the bodies, investigators noted a small notebook. On one page was a set of instructions. The English translation is 1630, be at the agreed place. 1830, ingest capsules. After the effect, protect metals, await signal, mask. That's it. No further explanation. No mention of what the capsules were or what kind of signal they expected. Investigators searched the scene, but found no trace of the capsules themselves. No pill containers, no packaging, not even fragments. Which means either the men swallowed them and disposed of any evidence, or the capsules were never there in the first place. The phrase, protect metals, has puzzled researchers for decades. Was it a reminder to cover the lead masks, or some kind of shielding? An await signal mask suggests the masks were not just symbolic. It implies they were meant to protect the men from some kind of flash, burst, or encounter. The most haunting objects in this story are the masks themselves. 2 crude plates of lead, each shaped to fit over the eyes. Again, they weren't goggles. They weren't store-bought. Investigators described them as homemade, hand-cut from sheets of lead. No receipts, no supplier, no workshop was ever identified. To this day, no one knows exactly where the lead came from or how the masks were fastened to the men's faces. They could have been tied with wire or simply laid in place. What we do know is that they were heavy and they blocked vision entirely. And here's the problem. We don't have clear close-up photographs of the masks themselves. Brazilian newspapers publish photos of the hillside, but not the masks on an evidence table. What we know comes from written descriptions. So we're left to puzzle over what purpose they could have served. Some argue the masks were practical. Protection against a blinding flash, a burst of radiation, or some dazzling signal they expected to encounter. Others see them as ritual tools. In the tradition of scientific spiritualism, covering the eyes might symbolize closing off ordinary vision in order to see something extraordinary. And then there's the simplest explanation: belief in lead as protection. Even without scientific grounding, lead has long carried the idea of shielding from radiation, from unseen forces, from harm. If Cruz and Viana believed that they were about to face something dangerous to look at, lead plates might have seemed like the answer. Whatever the intent, the masks point to preparation. These weren't men caught off guard. They brought these objects with them. They planned for a moment they thought was coming. The bodies of Cruz and Viana were taken down from the hillside and transported to the Instituto Médico Legal, Rio's medical examiner's office. But here the investigation hits its greatest obstacle. The autopsies weren't performed right away. By the time doctors opened the bodies, decomposition had set in to the point where vital organs were no longer usable for reliable toxicology. In other words, if the men had ingested anything, drugs, poison, even a massive dose of a hallucinogen, the evidence had already slipped away. The official result was frustratingly brief. Cause of death, indeterminate. There were no signs of external trauma, no bullet wounds, no bruising to suggest a struggle, no evidence of robbery either. One report notes that they were still carrying cash. Everything at the scene suggested preparation, not violence. Police combed through the men's backgrounds. They found books on spiritualism at their homes, notes about experiments, and testimonies from friends who said the men believed that they could make contact with other entities. The working hypothesis became Cruz and Viana went to the hillside to perform a ritual experiment. There they ingested capsules, contents unknown, and something went wrong. So let's take a look at some of the theories. The most obvious theory is right there in the notebook. 1830, ingest capsules. The men may have taken some kind of drug as part of the ritual. But the question is, what drug? In the 1960s, hallucinogens were beginning to spread beyond research labs into countercultural circles. It's possible Cruz and Viana had gotten a hold of something like LSD or mescaline. But the problem is that LSD usually doesn't kill you. Toxicology experts say that LSD is physiologically very safe at ordinary doses. Deaths coming directly from the drug are vanishingly rare, usually involving extreme overdoses or contaminated substances. In other words, it's hard to imagine both men dying simply because they took acid. And a quick note about mescaline. Like LSD, mescaline is a classic psychedelic whose physiology toxicity is low at typical doses. Ritual or recreational doses are usually in the hundreds of milligrams, enough to cause nausea, dizziness, elevated heart rate, and intense hallucinations, but not normally enough to kill a healthy adult outright. Fatalities attributed solely to mescaline are extremely rare. When deaths have occurred in the historical record, they usually involve adulterated plant extracts, underlying medical conditions, or dangerous situational factors, like dehydration, heat stroke, falls, or accidents while in an altered state. So in short, mescaline itself is unlikely to explain the simultaneous deaths of two otherwise healthy men on a hillside. Unless the capsules were contaminated, the dose was enormous, or environmental stresses like exposure, dehydration, or panic turned a bad trip into a fatal situation. And remember, investigators never found the capsules. No pill bottles, no wrappers, nothing. If they swallowed them, they left no trace. If they didn't, then the instructions in the notebook become even stranger. Without the capsules to test, and with the bodies too composed for meaningful analysis, the overdose theory has always remained more of a guess than a proven explanation. Second theory: suicide or ritual misadventure. From early on, police floated another explanation: suicide. The men, they argued, had gone up the hill with the intention of ending their lives. But that theory runs into problems almost immediately. For one, the notebook doesn't read like a farewell. It's like a checklist, a set of steps. Be at the place, ingest capsules, protect metals, await signal, mask. That isn't the language of despair, it's the language of a procedure. Then there's the practical problem. If suicide was the plan, then where were the capsules? Investigators found nothing. Again, no wrappers, no vials, no remains of pills. It's a conspicuous absence. And there's another piece that feels off. In poisoning cases, you often see signs: vomit at the scene, fluids around the mouth or nose. Yet the police reports, newspaper accounts, and even the photographs taken at the hillside don't mention anything like that. If it had been there, someone would have noted it, which makes the overdose suicide angle even harder to square. And unlike many suicide cases, these men hadn't left notes for their families, hadn't put their affairs in order. They had told relatives that they were going to Niterói to buy electronics, maybe even a car. Hardly the cover story for two men bent on dying. Which leaves a more nuanced possibility. Not suicide, but a ritual misadventure. Cruz and Viana weren't trying to die, they were trying to conduct an experiment. They prepared the masks, followed their instructions, and ingested capsules that were supposed to open a door. But instead of revelation, something went fatally wrong. And then there's another possibility that hides in plain sight, and one I wanted to look more deeply into, and this is environmental exposure. Because again, remember, the bodies weren't found for 3 days. So I looked into it. In August, Niterói's days are warm and its nights are mild, usually around 25 degrees Celsius by day and 19 at night. Not freezing, and certainly not desert hot. But if you've ingested an unknown capsule and become disoriented, even mild weather can turn hostile. So picture the slope of Morro do Vintem. Steep, grassy, with a little shade. The men had only a single bottle of water, which lay empty by their bodies. They wore raincoats, fine protection if you expect rain, but also a layer that can trap heat and sweat under the afternoon sun, or chill you with dampness as night air settles in. Dehydration, disorientation, an undiagnosed heart condition, any of these could have tipped them over the edge. Perhaps they lay down expecting a signal, but instead, their bodies gave out under stress they could no longer recover from. It's not a dramatic explanation. No poison capsules, no dazzling flash, but exposure, paired with incapacity, remains one of the simplest ways two healthy men could die side by side, without violence in the span of a few hours. And last but not least, the notebook's most haunting phrase is the last: await signal, mask. It suggests Cruz and Viana weren't simply waiting for a drug to kick in. They were waiting for something else. In the days after their deaths, stories began to circulate in Niterói. Residents claimed to have seen lights over Morro do Vintem. One witness said she and her children saw an oval orange object with a fiery ring around it, sending out blue rays. Now, these reports weren't part of the police file that we can see today, but they were collected later by UFO researchers and reprinted in magazines like Flying Saucer Review, which makes them intriguing, but not ironclad. Still, it's easy to see how believers in scientific spiritualism might have read their notebook as a countdown to contact. The raincoats, the towels, the lead masks, all precautions as if they expected a burst of light or energy that would overwhelm unprotected eyes. If they were truly waiting for a signal, then the tragedy is that the only thing that came was silence. So what happened on Morro do Vintém? The evidence leaves us with theories, but no certainties. The drug explanation is tempting. It's right there in the notebook. But LSD rarely kills outright, and mescaline is no more lethal. And without the capsules themselves, we can't prove what they took, or if they took anything at all. The suicide theory never quite holds. There were no farewell notes, no tidy goodbyes, and the checklist reads like a procedure, not a death wish. The absence of vomit or fluids around the bodies makes poisoning less likely too. The exposure hypothesis is simple, and in some ways the most convincing. A hillside, mild but wearing weather, 1 bottle of water, and 2 men perhaps incapacitated by a substance or overwhelmed by panic. The body doesn't always need foul play to fail. But some details refuse to fit neatly into that picture. The most obvious? Their suits. Who wears formal jackets, ties, and raincoats to climb a steep hillside and conduct an experiment? Unless appearances mattered. Unless they were meeting someone. Or unless, in their minds, they were dressing for something extraordinary. And then there's the autopsy delay. 3 days in the Rio heat before the bodies were examined. By then, decomposition had erased the only real chance at answers. Cause of death was ruled indeterminate, not because it was unknowable, but because the evidence had slipped away. Which leaves us with the masks, the notebook, the raincoats, and the phrase, await signal, mask. In the end, 2 men lay side by side in the grass. Their preparations survive, and their reasons do not. The story of lead mass ends where it began, with more questions than answers. 2 men in suits and raincoats climb a hill, carry towels and a single bottle of water, and leave behind one of the strangest puzzles in forensic history. Theories abound: drugs, exposure, ritual misadventure, and even UFOs. But without the evidence that decomposed before it could be tested, the truth lies just out of reach. What we're left with are the artifacts: a notebook, a pair of towels, 2 raincoats, and those eerie lead masks. Objects heavy enough to survive the years, but not heavy enough to anchor the story they were a part of. In the end, the mystery of Morro do Vintém is less about how they died and more about why they believed. Why 2 men would prepare so carefully, dress so formally, and shield their eyes with lead to wait for a signal that never came. Maybe we'll never know. But that's the thing about mysteries. Sometimes their power comes not from the answers, but from the silence they leave behind. Well, my friends, the fire burns low now, its embers casting faint red light across the room. The story of the lead mass of Vintém Hill leaves us with more questions than answers. 2 men, their journey ending on a lonely hillside. Their motives sealed beneath layers of secrecy and silence. Science, ritual, or something stranger still, the truth remains hidden, just out of reach. As the last sparks fade, we're left staring into the dark, reminded that some mysteries are destined to linger there, waiting. Until next time, when you return to sit by the fire, and together we step once more into the void.